Welcome to Session 8, Rest, Work, and Family in Plantation Capitalism.
Good morning, Hayley. Those are sharp glasses.
Oh, thank you. I love them. Hi. What are we talking about today?
Today, we're going to pivot in our series. In the last 7 sessions, we covered scripture and history, especially bits of church history that show what a difference there is between plantation capitalism and Jesus's Jubilee economy. Now that we've laid that foundation, we want to look practically at life today. So we'll be talking about rest, work, and family. And we'll be reading from a potential book chapter that we've written.
Right. For almost 2 decades, my husband worked as a manager for a large and well-known retail store chain. He worked many evenings, so I put the kids to bed alone. He worked all weekend, nearly every weekend. He also worked all day on most major holidays. He was electronically tethered to the machines because the system would automatically call him with warnings and service requests. This difficult lifestyle was taxing on my husband's body, creating digestive problems, physical injuries, and sleep disruptions. The work took an emotional toll, too. Holiday shopping, in particular, tended to bring out the worst of people's anger. My husband dreaded the holidays. Through Christmas and New Year's, the big rig semis came in more often, not less. My husband would be so physically worn out that he would come home nauseous. He endured temper tantrums of customers yelling about out-of-stock items because they felt like their plans to be gracious hosts to their friends were jeopardized. People threw cans of food directly at him, even though they were the ones who had left the food in their car for days or weeks. Even now, we're still emotionally recovering from the dizzying incongruence between our rhythms and the demands of the world. Indeed, for a long time, we were the losers of a society that wanted a flawless supply chain with pristine products on a shelf at the end of the line. I adapted to this lifestyle and molded my work schedule and temperament around my husband's needs. Then, my life suddenly changed. In 2007, my husband and I brought our first daughter home. Although I was experienced as a teacher and caregiver to children, I wasn't prepared for the loneliness of evenings spent nursing a baby who wanted to cluster feed until 10 p.m. In this world before smartphones with weak and slow Wi-Fi, I tried to engage my brain with a laptop perched on a side table next to my second-hand glider. Mostly, though, I quietly nursed my baby in a darkened room for hours at a time while my husband worked late hours. I was forced to rest, to slow down, and to sit still with my thoughts. I was a slightly unwilling participant in a strangely restful state. Regrettably, I did not see this chapter as refreshment for my soul. Indeed, I felt very bored. But through my early mothering years, I began to cultivate a taste for the refreshment of Sabbath. There was something else that tinged my nursing-induced boredom. A feeling of uselessness edged into my brain, making me feel like I ought to be working, producing, or doing something other than sitting still. I knew that I was doing the joyful, necessary, and mostly invisible labor of mothering. I was also working part-time, making decent money as a music teacher. But those long nights with a peaceful baby in my arms were saturated by both tender peace and a creeping sense of guilt. I felt that I ought to be up and about, bustling and busy. I felt as though I ought to be able to justify the reason why I needed to sit in the glider in the darkness with nothing but my thoughts. Surely it was too indulgent to nurse my baby, too indolent to allow her to sleep in my arms. I adjusted our family's rhythms to match my husband's so that we could feel connected and happy. Consequently, I had a hard time scheduling social events with other families. Friday nights didn't carry the joyous relief of the end of another work week because a Friday might actually be our Monday, and that Monday would move around as his weekends shifted. We were rarely able to attend church together, and when we did, he had to leave in a rush to make it to work. Our little family couldn't spend the holidays with extended family like other people did. We were never able to fully rest with this unorthodox schedule because we were always a step behind or ahead the rhythms of society. When I think about the topic of rest, I think about the tense and complicated relationship that American Christians seem to have with rest. I think about the striving and performativity that permeates church culture, particularly amongst women. As a newer Christian, I marveled at the atmosphere in many Sunday morning church lobbies. It seemed like a world of effortless coastal leisure with a lot of Bible talk. As a Christian, I ought to have felt safe amongst such nice people spending their weekend having pleasant chats in the church lobby. But I was confused by the subtle, intangible, Stepford esque buzz. I sensed that perhaps these perfect performances of timed and defined socializing were not the Sabbath that my soul needed. I wanted a genuine, restful connection with Christians. I wanted a mutual dependency with others so that I didn't have to shoulder my burdens alone. My life as a retail widow prompts me to somberly reflect on the concept of rest. Because my life was dragged along by a supply chain, there was a human and relational cost that my family and I daily paid. Perhaps worst of all, at church services and events, other Christians would constantly ask me where my husband was. They looked at me with pity, as if my husband wasn't a Christian, or condescension. Perhaps I look like a single mother to them, or confusion.
Rest can feel like a grudgingly accepted pit stop. It seems acceptable only if we've worked hard and or promised to work hard in the future. This limited perspective stifles the image of God in us. We lose our divinely given sense of creativity when we interpret rest as stark and utilitarian. We lose out on the true joy of recreation when we treat ourselves like a device that needs to be quickly turned off and back on. The guilt that we feel from languid restfulness may drive odd shortcuts. Consider the Uberman sleep cycle, where people believe a series of brief naps instead of a night of sleep is sufficient for thriving. Common sense tells us that this is unsustainable. It's like burning a candle at both ends. Indeed, there's no evidence to suggest that this is healthy, and much to prove that it's harmful. Even Seinfeld poked fun at this odd idea when the character Kramer tried napping instead of sleeping at night. Comically, Kramer ended up dumped in a river when he predictably fell asleep, as though dead, on top of a girlfriend. It isn't so funny, though, when we're trying to biohack our real lives. There are no true shortcuts for restorative rest.
Sleep training is a hot topic for tired parents desperate for rest. I remember receiving a copy of a book that advocated for an unyielding, cried out method that promised to give me back my time so that I could get back to work. I tried and personally failed when my baby failed to sleep. My failure made me feel like I was both wasting time and unable to rest. Why is rest so complicated? Several years ago, a friend shared a story from her early mothering years. She lamented to a group of Christian women that her house felt messy while nursing a baby and caring for a rowdy toddler. The oldest woman in this group chirped up a bubbly condemnation that her granular moment to moment mothering a messy house were the result of being an easily manipulated mother. Thus, the correct solution was to not comfort the crying baby, but to be a flawless homemaker no matter what the human cost. It was a disorienting drive-by burn that left my friend feeling like there was no way to succeed. Surely the only acceptable path would involve the kids emotionally set adrift, a mom burned to a crisp, all while trying to homeschool. Even in the privacy of her own home, my friend could not find true rest. Why must a mother at home feel as though she needs to be measurably ultra productive in the vital soft skills of parenting?
It's complicated to rest. And Christians seem to have a work ethic that makes necessary rest feel like vice by stretching earthly productivity to an extreme. Harder, better, faster, stronger, as the Daft Punk song goes, with robot voices telling us that, quote, our work is never over. Getting lost in the adrenaline-fueled shuffle of work, at its worst, might be like an endless buffet of all-you-can-eat cotton candy, sweet and slightly crunchy, addictive enough to have you mindlessly chomping on a huge cloud of sugary work. But like a dinner of cotton candy, workaholism will lead to regret later on. A morally vacant work ethic that demands harder, better, faster, stronger backs humans into a black and white cognitive distortion. The logical but faulty conclusion seems to be a life of relentless work, followed by a nebulous retirement of total leisure. Indeed, contrary to Daft Punk's song, at some point, our work is actually over. Perhaps we're struck by an illness, constrained by caretaking of a loved one, or simply retired after a long career. Maybe you're rocking a sleeping baby while wishing you could get up to do something productive. An anemic work ethic, starved for light and breathing room, snickers that we're now out of the race, no longer useful, and utterly marginalized. Whether questionable or downright bad, these quote-unquote Christian teachings still haunt us. First, when English settlers colonized North America, they drew on Calvinist theology and the quote-unquote Protestant work ethic. Protestants influenced by Calvinism believed that they had to prove their sanctification in their occupation, and not just by their Christ-likeness, but by their productivity in that occupation. If you didn't become successful in business, your salvation was in question. John Calvin even believed that you should work for low wages, always, throughout your working life. This was the penny-pinching version of today's prosperity gospel. Then, when the Founding Fathers wrote the U.S. Constitution, they drew on the thought of John Locke and his theory of private property. Locke believed that the English colonizers were justified in taking land from Native Americans because he interpreted Genesis 1 in a way that was unprecedented. Christians prior to John Locke interpreted Genesis 1 to mean that God intended for every human being to share in the resources of God's good creation. Every human being. Locke, however, believed God authorized the English to take native lands and displace native people because the English were more productive with the land. The flip side of accusing non-white people of laziness means that today everyone feels that we must constantly earn our place. Property, and indeed survival, can never be a team effort in John Locke's framework, which is very important if you're not earning a formal salary because of family commitments or disability or other things. There's a strong libertarian wing of Americans who want to strip away the social safety net of unemployment benefits, Social Security, health care, and other things that are important to human flourishing. Partly because of John Locke, you feel like you need to earn your place through work. But wait, didn't the Apostle Paul tell Christians to work as unto the Lord? If that's in Ephesians 6, verse 7, and Colossians 3, verse 17. Yes, but he also told them to not easily give other people authority over their bodies in 1 Corinthians 6, 18 through 20, and then he fleshed that out in relation to servanthood or slavery in chapter 7. Paul would certainly want Christians in the workplace to be competent and to do the job we signed up for. But he would not want us to be devoted to the financial bottom line or dedicated to advancement or to work ourselves to death. Neither would he advocate that we neglect Christian kindness and mission while we work. If Jesus himself were in our workplace, surely he would take opportunities to take kindness and share about himself and rest. As we explained in session 3 of this series on Plantation Capitalism versus Jesus' Jubilee Economy, Paul applies this principle of Jesus' lordship over each person by concretely limiting how binding human relationships can become. Paul even promotes singleness over marriage as a lifestyle choice to help Christians be more available to the church community and to the mission of Jesus. That's in 1 Corinthians 7. In that same context, Paul tells Christians not to become slaves of people in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 21 to 23, because in the Greco-Roman world, a few forms of slavery were actually career-advancing steps, and Paul is against that. He wants to promote undistracted devotion to the Lord in verse 35 of chapter 7. Productivity is not the same thing, But these are examples of how Christians have allowed the demands of capitalism to influence Christian teaching and why we suffer as a result. What is left after a long career, even a successful one, if true rest is not cultivated constantly over the course of one's life? Retirement can be unfulfilling when people expect an endless stretch of leisure to become a nonstop party. People who uproot their lives to live in an intentional Margaritaville find that they get bored of cruising around in golf carts to the liquor store and bar every day. God did not make us human beings who could defer rest until we're 65. God made us to work and rest, grow and reflect at a human pace in a healthy rhythm. When we're in a state of perpetual overwork, perhaps we employ gallows humor to shrug off, justify, or cope with it. I'll sleep when I'm dead, as the old saying goes. But we're not capable of work without rest. We are painfully limited, with our brains beginning to slow after only 16 hours of awake time. If one seriously considers the afterlife, we will not sleep when we're dead. In eternity, we will not be limited by a short 16-hour per day cognitive ration. We won't need to eat and recover our energy. Rest as we know and feel it inside of these bodies will not be the same. Our limited store of physical and cognitive energy reminds us that we're dependent on others for survival, no matter how independent we want to be. We are not impenetrable islands of safety, and we require society for safety. Shouldn't we think about rest on the weekend as a reward for our work during the week? No. In fact, thinking about rest as a reward for work is precisely backwards. God trained the people of Israel to recognize rest as the precondition for working and the prelude to thriving. The creation hymn of Genesis 1:1 to 2:3 introduces us to how God established a rhythm which prioritized rest. Since the word day doesn't mean a 24-hour period when it's used in Genesis 2:4, the poetic structure is meant to help us think about God's experience of a week or establishing a week. And that's meant to inform our posture towards rest. And because of the patterned language of Genesis 1, the Jewish calendar takes sunset and not midnight as the beginning of each new day. Sunset was the threshold. In Genesis 1, starting in verse 5, but repeated afterwards, the text says, there was evening and there was morning, a new day. Meaning, the people of God experienced each new day as beginning with not this bleary-eyed, rushed time in the bathroom before we dashed off to work in the morning, but with a meal, fellowship, and then sleep. God intends for us to think about rest not as a reward for work, but the reverse. Work is the reward for resting well. Rest is a baseline of human experience and a precondition for work. What's more, to the extent that Genesis 1 wants us to imagine creation as 1 week, we're meant to imagine God making rest and relationship the first real steps to being human. God made Adam and Eve on the 6th day. He hung out with them for a meal and quality time, and then told them to go to sleep so they could get up on the 7th day. To do what? To rest on the first Sabbath day. God gave Adam and Eve a good night's sleep so that they could be refreshed for more refreshment. Huh? How does that make sense?
One New Year's Eve, I tried to explain to my young children that every new day begins at midnight. To their minds, it seemed counterintuitive that a new day would slip in during the middle of the night. Why wouldn't the day end at bedtime? At the time, this was a funny moment where my kids were bargaining to stay up until midnight for fireworks and celebrations. But in retrospect, my children's instincts seem to make more sense in the context of the creation story. Rest is a foundational priority in the life of humans, and starting the day with rest makes sense. If we begin the day with sleep, then we arise hours later refreshed and ready for new challenges. Our work and play the next day flows out of our rest.
When God delivered Israel out of Egypt, he called them into weekly Sabbath rest as a whole community. in Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11. Why? Well, for one thing, it was a contrast with Pharaoh in Egypt. Initially, Moses told Pharaoh to let the Israelites go worship God and celebrate a festival to God in the wilderness. That's Exodus 5, verse 1. Pharaoh refused. Like many plantation capitalist owners, he claimed to see that laziness was the real motive lurking behind the workers' stated desire to worship. He said, "They are lazy. That is why they are crying out, 'Let us go and sacrifice to our God.'" Pharaoh made the work harder instead. Clearly, God asserted that people needed rest as a boundary against the empire's bullying and gaslighting. When God brought Israel into the Garden Land, God's command to rest showed Israel that God was the one who nourished people and creation, even while people rested. God established the Sabbath so that his people could reflect on what they learned during the past week. Feel grateful to God who made the sun shine, the rain fall, the crops grow, and the animals play. Say thank you to those who helped us, including God, of course. Consider how our relationships might improve, how our abilities and character might grow in the coming week.
Consider how we in modern times appreciate restful restoration and connection that happens in the space between events. After my fifth grader's promotion ceremony, even grocery store cupcakes and room temperature bottles of water became a memorable experience for families. It doesn't need to be elaborate, but it would be strange if we ended an academic year without a reception. There is community breathing room in the gaps between events. We create ceremonies to gather and rest together. After a graduation or a wedding, after a successful event or team victory, we instinctively know that we need to feel our feelings as a group during these times.
God meant for Sabbath to nurture our desire for eternity. In the space of the Sabbath rest, we pause to appreciate the way we've grown. We saw new flowers bloom. We learned a new skill. We saw a new quality in a friend. We reflect on the help we gave a neighbor. We savor the new meal we made because we learned about this herb and that spice. We also grieve the things we lost, the children who will never be small again, the sunset that will not return in quite the same way, the pet who died. We pause to feel regret over the mistakes we made. We give to God the impatience we feel. We renew our commitment to grow at God's pace, which delightfully matches our human pace, as Psalm 23 says. We develop a longing for goodness, love, life, people, and creation. We want time to be compressed so that each moment would have even deeper meaning and yet be stretched out to savor them for much longer. That's how Sabbath rest whets our appetite for eternity.
On my 40th birthday, I received the usual round of well-intentioned jokes about getting older and pining for my youth. But these comments don't land right for me. After all, the only other option to living long would be tragically dying young. I'm grateful to be alive and grateful for the opportunity to grow old. I don't miss my youth. The lesson of a long life is to nurture our desire for eternity. A good long life includes learning the true value of rest so that we can enter eternity prepared. We are meant to be gardeners, growing a heart that is ready for eternal rest. In Erikson's final stage of psychosocial development, humans are observed to reflect on their lives. They may struggle to work through despair over mistakes and missed opportunities. Ideally, at the end of life, we can reach a point where we can feel that our lives have integrity, have mattered, and had a positive impact on our communities. Ultimately, we achieve rest in this last phase of life by developing a confident sense that it has, quote, been okay to be me. Some people feel guilty or anxious when they take a vacation from work. We call this internalized capitalism. Thus, even the guarantee of paid time off isn't the hall pass for rest that it's meant to be. Americans might interpret this as a good thing. Don't we want people with a robust work ethic? However, we might also interpret this as our need to mature further in spiritual formation towards a God-given command to take rest seriously.
God valued Sabbath rest for Israel so much that he established the Jubilee year to ensure that every new generation of Israelites experienced it. The Jubilee year was a hallmark of Jubilee economy. In Leviticus 25, God established smaller patterns of rest prior to the Jubilee year, rest for the land every seventh year. In effect, God promised to nourish Israel from the land by himself, without them putting tools into the soil or pulling up the weeds, in a powerful reminder that he is the great creator and gardener. That by itself is remarkable. And then, after 7 cycles of those 7 years, that is, in year 50, Israel proclaimed its Jubilee year. After the 49th year, which was itself a year of rest for the land, God started a new cycle for the Israelites with another full year of rest for the land and the people. It was a reenacted memory of God bringing Israel into the garden land for the first time, when the people had to harvest but not plant. It was a hint of the awe and wonder that Adam and Eve had in the original Garden of Eden. God reset land to its original family land boundaries. God set people free from debt. Anyone in service to another household, God restored to his or her family lands. Curiously, Egypt observed its own Jubilee, at least at times. In the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art, there's an ancient Egyptian limestone with hieroglyphic carvings on it. The carvings are called Scenes from a King's 30-Year Jubilee in Dynasty 4, probably from the reign of Snefru from 2575 to 2551 BC. It reads, "After 30 years on the throne, the Pharaoh celebrated a jubilee intended magically to rejuvenate the divine yet vulnerable monarch. In Egypt, the jubilee was for the Pharaoh, who demanded that life flow from the bottom to the top of the social hierarchy. Egypt's jubilee made the people work all the more. Not so with Israel. By contrast, God commanded Israel to celebrate a jubilee which was for them and their children, where life flowed from God to the people, not the other way around. In Egypt's jubilee, the fruit of the earth went to Pharaoh, but in Israel's jubilee, God gave the earth itself, the basis of their life and their lived connection to the Garden of Eden story, to the Israelites. If you were the one releasing land back to your neighbor, or releasing someone from debt and service, you had the chance to participate in God's work of giving that person rest."
In order to love our neighbor, we have to care about their rest. But we might first ask ourselves why God created life so that we are dependent on each other for rest. Dependency is not just for babies. Adults rely on each other for rest. We rest at night knowing that society has established 24-hour services to respond in an emergency. We work to keep electricity flowing all night to charge our phones and keep the refrigerator running. Long before your early morning travel, someone has stayed up late to drive a truck full of food to breakfast cafes. Someone is unloading baggage from the last flight of the day, or waking up long before dawn to prepare the train for the morning commute. Some work at night so that others can rest, and vice versa. Our rest depends on the work of others. Christians, at least in theory, aim to apply the Good Samaritan principle in life. This concept deserves more reflection so we can care about whether our neighbors have adequate rest. In this parable, the teacher of the law intended to justify himself by asking Jesus to define who counts as a neighbor. Before we can read onward to the compassion of the Samaritan man, we have to question the motivations behind the teacher of the law. Why did he ask this of Jesus? A prominent, learned teacher of God's own word felt bold enough to ask who could possibly be elevated enough to reach the level of neighbor. Who, he asks, in effect, has the honor of being my neighbor? The teacher of the law centered himself. Jesus turns that implied question upside down. Jesus centers the person who doesn't have the power, energy, health, and resources to recover from injury. Jesus centers the one who needs rest.
Jesus' response to the teacher shifts the focus of the question. He asks, who was a neighbor to the man who was beaten and robbed? Jesus takes the hand of someone without power or societal cachet and tenderly accompanies them into the middle of the chorus of humans. He does this so that everyone can hear their story, respond empathetically, and join in their struggle. As God incarnate decenters the powerful and moves the tectonic plates of emotional resistance, the question we must ask is clear. Who needs our help to rest?
You people seem to understand the lonely human cost of having a spouse in a demanding working class job. When I was a tired mom of two hoping to find a hint of rest in the midst of Christians, I searched for Christian support. When I learned that there was an organized Christian support network for spouses of medical professionals at local hospitals, I was hopeful that I could find companionship. I asked if I could join, but I was turned away as my husband was not a doctor. It's relevant to wonder if the spirit of the megachurch could ever produce empathy for working class people and their need to rest. Are Christian leaders willing to bend over backwards for high status, wealthy professionals because they can give money? Loving all of our neighbors as ourselves requires empathy for everyone without partiality.
You can be a neighbor to the person who hands you your caffeine fix at the coffee shop in the morning, or to the person who bags your groceries that you grabbed just moments before closing on a harried weekday evening. Your neighbors make sandwiches at the gas station cafe. Your neighbors collect your trash and recyclables from the curb. Your neighbors build the new houses popping up across town. It is not just anyone who does these jobs. Your neighbors are the people who surround you throughout your day. Surely we want a healthy community with rested, refreshed, and happy neighbors. Surely we want as much good for those around us as possible.
Jesus described a man who was stripped, beaten, and left half dead by robbers. Work can rob us of health and life. People who want and need rest are pressured to be productive. Some might coax extra adrenaline out of their bodies. Perhaps they're made out of stiffer stuff. But for most, putting on a happy face for work is like a zebra putting itself in front of a lion. When a zebra is chased by a lion, its body diverts energy away from its digestive and immune systems to its muscles and senses. Within a few minutes, if the zebra outruns a lion, its body will go back to normal. That's why, as biologist Robert Sapolsky says, zebras don't get ulcers. We, on the other hand, put ourselves constantly in front of lions of our own making. And sometimes other people become the lions. Others become the prey.
When I worked at Intel Corporation in Silicon Valley in the 1990s, I once broke out in hives. I'd been under a tight deadline. I put in 14 to 16-hour days for a week. I didn't notice the tension in my shoulders and neck as I worked with my keyboard and mouse. At the end of the week, my skin burst out with angry red welts, itchy and painful. Not sure whether I'd eaten something strange, I went to the doctor. She asked, "Are you under a lot of stress at work?" I said, "Yes, but I thought I was handling it okay. Why do you think it's stress?" And she said, "Because I had stress hives throughout my entire first semester of med school." I've thought about her statement a lot since I now struggle with carpal tunnel syndrome, the result of my years of keyboarding work.
In his article, Building an Economy of Rest, Dawson Vosberg, a writer at the Evangelical Labor Institute, suggests that many people face challenges stemming from a punishing work-life balance. Americans work far more hours on average, 1,767, than their Canadian, 1,644, and European, 1,513 counterparts. Tired American parents can gaze across the pond at Norwegians who receive 35 weeks of fully paid leave as a guarantee. They can look north at Canadians who get 17 weeks of parental leave. What happens in an economy laser focused on production and profits? Vosberg says we lose out on rest, deep, restorative, regenerative rest.
We see this everywhere. Amazon drivers and warehouse workers feel so pressured by Amazon's demands that they urinate in bottles. Amazon's warehouse workers injure themselves by repetitive motion at twice the rate as Walmart workers. Facebook content moderators see so much violence, vitriol, and porn that they experience moral burnout and vicarious trauma. Professors are given maternal and paternal leave, but the women professors fall behind because their male counterparts use parental leave to get ahead. Despite all of the work squeezed out by the populace, American poverty levels remain higher than both Europe and Canada. Our supposed corporate overlords know how to keep us scrambling. We hope conditions for American workers get worse, said corporate executives at Bank of America, as the Federal Reserve hiked interest rates in 2022.
We need to acknowledge the human cost of 24/7 services. When Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan, he said the Samaritan took the wounded man to the inn and said to the innkeeper, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I return, I will repay you," in Luke 10:35. How do we care for people wounded by work?
God tells us it's imperative that we do. In Scripture, another prophet condemned abusing workers. Isaiah looked at how wealthy Israelites in his day claimed to be pious and spiritual. Those Israelites complained to God, "Why have we fasted and you do not see? Why have we humbled ourselves and you do not notice?" Meanwhile, the Israelite bosses scammed their workers, keeping them poor. Workers who stayed poor, stayed vulnerable, and probably indebted, which meant they would continue in their desperation to accept low wages and work more hours. God said to the bosses, therefore,
"Behold, on the day of your fast you find desire, and drive hard all your workers. Behold, you fast for contention and strife and to strike with a wicked fist. You do not fast like you do today to make your voice heard on high. Is it a fast like this which I choose, a day for a man to humble himself? Is it for bowing one's head like a reed, and for spreading out sackcloth and ashes as a bed? Will you call this a fast, even an acceptable day to the Lord? Is this not the fast which I choose, to loosen the bonds of wickedness, to undo the bands of the yoke, and to let the oppressed go free, and break every yoke? Is it not to divide your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into the house, when you see the naked to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh?" And that's Isaiah 58:3-7.
the landowners were so greedy that they pressured their workers to work through the Sabbath, breaking God's commandment. If, because of the Sabbath, you turn your foot from doing your own pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord, honorable, and honor it, desisting from your own ways, from seeking your own pleasure, and speaking your own word. Isaiah 58:13. God cared not just about whether the boss took a Sabbath rest, but whether the boss allowed workers to do so too. The boss was hypocritical by heaping economic pressures on workers so that they missed God's Sabbath rest That should be instructive to us because in a democracy, we create the rules of the road together. We create the rules that could govern capitalism, that could restrain the hours of work. To look the other way on these issues is an evasion of responsibility because we need to care about whether they fall into disability. We need to care about what kind of bodies they have when they retire.
A church leader once pointedly told my husband that he must work a different shift so he could be at the Sunday church service. We were committed to this church. We were serving as leaders of a midweek home group and discipled younger believers. We diligently watched the Sunday recordings. Yet somehow none of this was enough. We had to be consistently physically present to keep up appearances. This person didn't ask how difficult getting another shift or job would be. Ironic, considering that he employed people to work for his company on the weekends. We were stuck in a job that required weekend work with no easy way out. My husband's employer kept dangling promotions, rest, and job security in front of him. And we didn't know how much more he would have to endure. Many Americans go camping or hunting to rest. That's worth a reflection. I am not outdoorsy, but I am fascinated by people who love the outdoors, particularly those who like the survival aspect. I enjoy watching peaceful solo camping videos on YouTube, tasting the apparent independence of being outdoors through their eyes. I choose the words apparent independence deliberately because it seems as though that is part of the appeal. Hiking alone in the wilderness has the allure of restful independence, to be sure. But my favorite YouTube campers bring the fruits of other people's labor with them to provide comfort and rest. They carry backpacks packed with shovels and prepackaged food. They have great hiking shoes and comfortable sandals. In many campgrounds, they use toilets, sinks, and faucets made by others.
Put humans into real survival mode, and we'll have a hard time resting. When my family and I went to Acadia National Park in Maine in August of 2014, we got rained on for over 48 hours straight. The tarps and rain flies couldn't hold back the water from our tents. Our sleeping bags got sopping wet. Our fingers pruned whenever we pulled our hands back from the fire. I felt gross touching my own skin because it was so sticky from the cold humidity. As humans, we have worked quite diligently together to manage our interaction with something as simple as water.
When we see modern Christians yearning after a restful, rural lifestyle of camping or agriculture, we see the arrogance of individualism. We can forget the ways we depend on others. Our ancestors tamed fire for cooking, which led to safe and efficient induction stoves today. They refined sanitation, eventually leading to plumbing, detergents, and labor-saving dishwashers. Our ancestors developed ways to decrease labor and increase rest. We have always relied on each other to work and rest. Together, we multiplied, worked, and rested. Why then do we have to become so individualistic about work and rest? As if I deserve or don't deserve to rest. As if my neighbor deserves or doesn't deserve to rest. Why do we re-enslave ourselves and our neighbors to the whip of constant productivity?
Well, that's all we have time for today. But join us next time for session 9 of Plantation Capitalism versus Jesus's Jubilee Economy when we talk about parenting in plantation capitalism.
Why did you stay at the park if you were getting rained on for 48 hours? I would leave after like 1 hour. Like, why did you stay 47 hours?
Of course, it was to see the sunrise.